I want to talk about priestly fraternity, which of course could and should be translated to fraternity in your seminary life. And just want to talk about why it's important, the great help that it can be to you in your life as a priest, the joy that it can bring and the struggle that it can bring. You know, some of you know that I'm one of the founders of the Companions of Christ, which is a fraternity of priests here in the Archdiocese. And this is not an attempt to get anyone to join the Companions of Christ. It's not an apology for the Companions of Christ. This is about really what every priest should embrace as fraternal life, right? And what are the kind of essential things that, based on the fact simply that we're priests, we should be living in fraternal life. Wherever we find that fraternity, this is about the essence of it. And so, basically I just would like to start by saying that certainly one of the greatest gifts of my life have been priestly friendships. Priestly friendships. And there's been a couple times in my life when I've even said to myself, wow, I didn't know you could have this good of a friend, Just didn't know it was possible to grow in deep friendship in the way that I have grown in friendship with some priests. And particularly brothers who have been there to walk with me in both difficult times and in good times. And the joy and the triumph of that has been, in the end, one of the great gifts of my life and something I'm extremely grateful to the Lord for. And I think it offers for us, as we pursue the ministry of priesthood, just a very important gift to begin to ponder and to let the Lord open up, because wherever you live your priesthood, we're not meant to do it alone. And as the Lord says, He says, I have called you friends. And Father Jeff often likes to say, where the Lord is, friendship flourishes, right? And so knowing that we need that, and that it's a great help to our ministry, our spiritual life, it's an important thing to reflect upon. And so that's what I'd like to do. And a lot of this talk comes from an academic book that was written many years ago called I Have Called You Friends, the Sacramental, Theological, and Existential Aspects of Priestly Fraternity. I put that on your handout. And that's written by a guy named Carlo Bertolla, who is an Italian priest. And he makes several interesting points in that book. He points out that the origins of the priesthood are in a fraternity, the apostolic fraternity. The scriptures always refer to it as the 12, right? These 12 brothers who live together. And he points to a very important scripture verse for the origins of the priesthood, which Cardinal Ratzinger also points to in his book on the priesthood. And that's Mark 3:13-15, where it says this: Jesus went up on the mountain and called to him those whom he desired, and they came to him. And he appointed 12 to be with him and to be sent out to preach and to have authority to cast out demons. And then he lists who the 12 apostles are, starting with Peter, right? So what's happening in this passage? Well, the Lord is selecting some of his disciples. He doesn't call all of his disciples. He calls 12 of them. And he invites them to a special mission that's rooted in a special relationship. In fact, even the words here that are present, when he says, he appointed them to be with him and to be sent out. Of course, that is the Greek word apostolane, right? He appointed them to be with him and to be apostles, to be sent out, right? And Ratzinger points out that's rooted in the Hebrew word shaliah, which was the word for mission or being sent, and referred actually to the Spirit. And so you have here in this sending of the apostles, Jesus sharing his own Spirit. As he says, the Spirit that will do what he did, cast out demons, preach with his authority. And he actually gives some of his apostles his own Spirit so that they can go forth and be his representatives. And in fact, in the Hebrew mindset, the one who was sent by a Messiah was the Messiah's representative, right? And so really our whole theology of in persona Christi is rooted right here in Mark chapter 3. That the apostles are sent in the person of Christ to carry out his mission. But notice a very important fact about this. He appointed the 12 to be with him and to be sent out. In other words, their mission is rooted in their relationship, right? What's the first thing they're supposed to do as an apostle? To be with Jesus, right? They're rooted in this relationship with Jesus, and in fact called into a special relationship with Jesus, a relationship that not everybody else gets to have with Jesus. They get to be with him always. They get to hear certain aspects of his teaching. Remember, there's times where he pulls the 12 aside, and he says things to them he doesn't say to other people, right? In fact, he even invites them to live his own way of life, a life of a celibate, itinerant preacher, right? And they're with him always living this life, right? A lot of people even theorize that, this is why in Matthew 19, when Jesus speaks about celibacy and he says, some are eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Like, why is that Greek word eunuch, which is obviously a derogatory word, why does the Lord use that word? Well, because that's the word people mocked Jesus and his apostles with. Those guys, they're a bunch of eunuchs. They don't get married, right? Or later in Matthew 19, after the story of the rich young man, right? Just right after that passage, when the rich young man is invited to come and follow, and he chooses not to. And then Jesus talks about how hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. And then Peter says, what about us? We're the ones who gave up everything and followed you. You see, that's how the apostles understood themselves, right? They were called into this mission with Jesus, and they were called to follow him in this very special way. And part of being an apostle was not only being in a relationship with Jesus, but it was to be invited into a community. The 12 formed a body, and they had, in certain ways, shared life together with Jesus, right? None of them got to follow Jesus alone. They were to belong to this community, and even when they were sent out 2 by 2, right? Obviously, this fraternity was important to Jesus. And one can imagine that this was not always easy for the apostles. And in fact, we don't have to imagine, because it's recorded in the scriptures, if you look, how difficult it was for the apostles to get along with each other, right? I mean, you imagine you have Matthew, who's a tax collector, and you have other very devout Jews, and now they're supposed to be part of this same small community, right? And what do we see? Well, we see that they fought with each other, and they argued about who was the greatest, and James and John were trying to get ahead of everybody else. We see lots of struggle. The struggle gets so bad that at one point Peter says to Jesus, how many times do I have to forgive my brother? And he says, as many as 7 times? We don't know if he's talking about Andrew or one of the other apostles, right? And Jesus says, no, as many as 70 times 7. And then he teaches them how to forgive each other, right? He says, if your brother sins against you, go to him. And he gives concrete rules for how to live in community life. Here's the key. From the beginning, to be invited into the apostle of Jesus was to be invited into a brotherhood, a fraternity. And Jesus, in very important moments, spoke about how this brotherhood was to be rooted in charity. So let's look at John 17. I do not pray for these only, but also for those who believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, even as you, Father, are in me and I in thee, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. And then in John 13, right after Jesus washes the apostles' feet, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another even as I have loved you, and that you also love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Of course, in some way, Jesus is speaking to all of his followers in those passages. But in the context, he's speaking to the 12. And so it must at least be true that the 12 are meant to be an example for all of the other followers of what unity and what service and charity look like. right? And this, in the tradition, becomes really an image for the bishop and his presbyters, right? The elders who surround the bishop, who are meant to, in a certain way, be an image of unity for the rest of the church to witness. This unity is not just rooted in the scriptures, it also has what we might call sacramental roots. It's rooted in the sacrament of holy orders itself, and just by the fact that it's an order, right? When you're ordained a deacon, you belong to the order of deacons. When you ordain a priest, you belong to the order of priests. And in fact, you're always ordained into a particular presbyterium, right? A particular group in which you must be incarnated, either a religious community or a diocese, right? And so the Second Vatican Council actually spoke quite a bit about this. In virtue of their common sacred ordination and mission, all priests are bound together in an intimate brotherhood, which naturally and freely manifests itself in mutual aid, spiritual as well as material, pastoral as well as personal, in their meetings and in communion of life, of labor, and charity. So it paints a picture of this intimate brotherhood which a priest is ordained into, right? And then Presbyterum Ordinis, the document on the priesthood itself, says this: priests, by virtue of their ordination to the priesthood, are united among themselves in an intimate sacramental brotherhood. In individual dioceses, priests form one priesthood under their own bishop. Notice no one's a priest in his own, right? You are, as a priest, a representative of Christ, and you participate in Christ's priesthood, but you participate also with all the rest of the priests in your diocese in the one priesthood of Christ, right? Even though priests are assigned to different duties, nevertheless, they carry on one priestly ministry for men. It's very important that all priests, whether diocesan or religious, help one another to be fellow workers in the truth. Each one, therefore, is united in special bonds of apostolic charity, ministry, and brotherhood with the other members of this priesthood. This has been manifest from ancient times in the liturgy, when the priests present at an ordination are invited to impose hands together with the ordaining bishop on the new candidate, and with united hearts concelebrate the sacred Eucharist. Each and every priest, therefore, is united with his fellow priests in a bond of charity, prayer, and total cooperation. In this manner, they manifest the unity which Christ willed, namely, that his own be perfected in one, so that the world might know that the Son was sent by the Father. See what they're saying? That the priests, united with their bishop, would reflect the unity of God so much that the world would know we're one. And the church would then know how to act as one, right? This happens all the time in very practical ways, and you can see this as a bishop. You see the priests who lead their people through difficulties towards unity, and those who lead them away from unity, right? Saw this especially when we went through the very difficult times of COVID. Those were extremely difficult times to be a bishop or a priest, right? Bishops and priests had to make very difficult decisions, and when they made those decisions, lots of people on either side were going to be angry. And you had certain people who led their people with their bishop through that in unity, even though it was hard, and others people who took pot shots at priests who took pot shots at their bishops, right? So there's a clear desire of the church flowing from the Lord's will for unity. It's interesting because some people say that there's no dogmatic development in the Second Vatican Council. It's not true. There's lots of different dogmatic developments that happen, and two of them happen actually in the understanding of the priesthood. So one is this idea that the bishop is the fullness of the priesthood, right? That's only first dogmatically defined at Vatican II. St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, would have said the priest is the highest of the orders, and a bishop is a priest simply with more jurisdiction or more authority in a certain way. But he's no more a priest, where Vatican II says, no, the bishop is the fullness of the priesthood, right? He's more a priest because of what he does. The other development on the priesthood was this fact about speaking about a sacramental bond amongst priests. This never happened before Vatican II, but Vatican II says this. By virtue of their ordination to the priesthood, priests are united among themselves in an intimate sacramental brotherhood. That sacramental brotherhood, a sacramental bond, is what unites priests. There's only two places we speak about that in the church, a sacramental bond. Uniting priests and uniting a husband and wife, right? That's also a sacramental bond, right? And that sacramental bond can't be broken. That's the way sacramental bonds are, right? Once they're formed, they only end with death, right? So the point is, none of us does the priesthood alone. We share in this common sacrament, and our unity or our fraternity is rooted in our being as priests, because we're ordained into the one priesthood of Christ together. Of course, as Vatican II notes, this is symbolized by the laying on of hands at an ordination, right? All the priests who are there are required to lay hands. And therefore, this unity ought to be understood not simply in a sociological sense, like a club, even though there's a lot of truth to that, right? Priests do form a unique club. And it's unique because we have unique experiences that only other priests have, right? And we live in very intense lives, and only other priests understand that in a certain way. And so there is that kind of sociological phenomena, but it's actually something deeper. And it's rooted and meant to be rooted in our union with Christ. That as we live deep unity with Christ, we're meant to live deep unity with each other. And when we do that, the benefit are the people of God. Because the ministry of the church, especially of the local church, of the diocese, happens with more clarity, right? Now, of course, this unity is not the same thing as uniformity. And in fact, the diversity of gifts is part of the gift of the priesthood, right? It's part of the gift of this chapel right now, right? The diversity of gifts in this chapel are part of the glory, the blessing of the priesthood. And the fact that we're not all the same is actually really important for the good of the church. And that's why some priests end up doing very different things in their ministry, right? I was never a pastor of a parish, never got to have that job. I had lots of other jobs that I did to serve the body, right? And I remember when I first was assigned to the seminary, it wasn't easy. It was like, you know, you're a priest, you want to be on the front lines. Like every soldier wants to serve on the front lines. And I felt like I was serving in supply, you know. Somebody's got to supply the new priest for the front lines, and that must be my job. But gradually, as I surrendered to that vocation, I began to see this was a beautiful way to live my priesthood, although very different from the way I had lived it in the parish, right? So what's key is we're called to a deep communion. And one could say it this way: priests ought to be experts in communion. Priests ought to be experts in communion. Communion is not an external imposed unity. Our communion as Catholics has certain external barriers and markings to it, right? But real unity is deeper than that. It's meant to be a communion of the heart, a communion of charity. That is, I'm not just part of the same club, but I actually love my brothers. And I want to show love for them, and I want them to experience that I love them. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no man than this, that a man may lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. Unity often involves laying down our lives. Unity often involves death to myself. Ask a husband or a wife sometime about what they have to go through to stay united. It always involves some kind of death to myself to make a gift of myself so that we can stay united. And so it means that at times I have to let go of my ego, my desires, my way that I want to do ministry, to be united with the bishop and the other priests of my diocese in order to serve the greater fruitfulness of ministry, right? Some of you might be familiar with the famous analogy that St. Ignatius of Antioch used. St. Ignatius is a remarkable figure. He's a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of St. John. So he's too removed from the apostles, right? And St. Ignatius is captured and put on trial in Rome, and he ultimately dies in the Colosseum, one of the few Christians who was martyred in the Colosseum, but he was. And St. Ignatius wrote several letters as he was traveling across first Greece, modern-day Greece, and on his way to Europe and to Rome. And he writes a lot about the role of the bishop and the role of the priest and the role of the deacon, which is kind of beautiful to think. Here he is writing right around the year 90, 100, and he's very clearly outlining these roles that he's received, right, from the apostles themselves. And in order to kind of emphasize the unity, he uses the image of a harp. Here's what he says, a harp, that makes music when the strings are all in tune. It is fitting that you should run together in accordance with the will of your bishop, which thing also you do. For your just renowned presbytery, worthy of God, is fitted exactly to the bishop as the strings are to the harp. Therefore, in your concord and harmonious love, Jesus Christ is sung. It's actually a very clear analogy, right? As they are in union with their bishop and with each other, there's a beautiful harmony. If they are out of union with their bishop and with each other, there's an incredible discord, right? Vatican II speaks about this and it points out really the concrete ways we seek to manifest this fraternity. All priests are bound together by an intimate brotherhood which naturally freely manifests itself in mutual aid, spiritual as well as material, pastoral as well as personal, in their meetings and in their common communion of life, of labor, and of charity. So how are the practical ways we're supposed to help each other? Mutual aid, spiritual, hearing a brother's confession, offering a brother spiritual counsel, getting spiritual direction, as well as material, helping my brother buy a car if he's having difficulty buying a car, right? Giving generously from one parish to another or from one person to another because my brother might live in an assignment where he has more need, right? Pastoral, that is, we should be working together, right, for the good of serving the gospel, but also as well as personal. I ought to be checking in on my brother, making sure he's okay, wondering why he didn't come to the deanery meeting. Are you okay? What's going on? Can I help you in some way? I remember once hearing Paul Ruff tell a story about his own brother. This was at a talk about priestly fraternity here in the Archdiocese some years ago. And he said this, he said two things. One, remember that men almost never tell you what they need, right? So when your brother calls up and says, hey, are you busy? What are you up to? You shouldn't just think, this is my brother who wants to hang out, because that's not the way men are. Men can be deeply in need, and they'll never call and say, hey, I'm deeply in need, will you come and see me, right? They say, hey, you want to hang out a little bit? And so we should pay attention to the way that men are, knowing that many times when our brother's asking or reaching out, there's something really deep that he needs. But then the second point he said, if my brother is in the hospital, I don't have an option of whether or not I'm going to help him. That's the way families are. He's my brother, right? I have to actually drop everything and go figure out what to do with my brother in the hospital. Shouldn't it be that way amongst us? Like, as priests, if a brother's in trouble, should we think, well, I'm kind of busy. Maybe I shouldn't reach out to help him, Or should it be like, no, this is my brother. I really don't have an option, right? I want to read this one paragraph from Presbyterorum Ordinis, even though it's extensive, because it gives very concrete advice about priestly fraternity. Older priests, therefore, should receive younger priests as true brothers and help them in their first undertakings in priestly duties. The older ones should likewise endeavor to understand the mentality of younger priests, even though it be different from their own, and follow their projects with goodwill. Just right there. Brothers, we just live in a time where older priests were formed very differently than you're being formed, right? And so how do you deal with that? Do you just write them off because they're old liberals? Do you just think, well, they're crazy and they think women should be priests and I don't want to talk to them? Or do you try to get to know them and care for them and recognize they actually, even though they're old liberals, they might have something to teach you, right? And of course, the same should be true of them, right? They might just want to write you off because you're young conservatives, but they should also listen. And when that kind of mutual listening happens, a lot of good can happen, right? By the same token, young priests should respect the age and experience of their seniors. They should seek their advice and willingly cooperate with them in everything that pertains to the care of souls. In a fraternal spirit, priests should extend hospitality, cultivate kindness, and share their goods in common. It's very strong, right? We should be willing to host our brothers at our rectories. We should be willing to share with them our own possessions as is needed, because in fact we form this brotherhood. They should be particularly solicitous for the sick, the afflicted, those overburdened with work, the lonely, those exiled from their homeland, and those who suffer persecution. They should gladly and joyfully gather together for recreation, remembering Christ's invitation to the weary apostles. Come aside to a deserted place and rest a while. And further, in order that priests may find mutual assistance in the development of their spiritual and intellectual life, and that they may be able to cooperate more effectively in their ministry and be safe from dangers of loneliness which may arise, it's necessary that some kind of common life or some sharing of common life should be encouraged among priests. This, however, may take many forms according to the different personal and pastoral needs, such as living together where this is possible or having a common table, or at least frequent and periodic meetings. One should also hold in high regard and eagerly promote those associations which have been recognized by competent ecclesiastical authority, encourage priestly holiness in the ministry by the use of appropriate, duly approved rule of life, and by fraternal aid, intending thus to do service to the whole order of priests. Finally, by reason of the same communion in the priesthood, priests should realize that they are obliged in a special manner towards those priests who labor under certain difficulties. They should give them timely help and also, if necessary, admonish them discreetly. Moreover, they should always treat with fraternal charity and magnanimity those who have failed in some matters, offer urgent prayers to God for them, and continually show themselves as true brothers and friends. It'd be great, actually, if sometime you just read this paragraph and try to think of practical ways you could do some of these things, right? Practical ways you could try to put some of these advices into practice. One thing I'd like to mention in particular is priestly support groups. It's a great tradition in the Diocese of Crookston. We have many priests, if not most, who are in some kind of fraternal priestly support group. I've always been in a fraternal priestly support group since the day I was ordained, and I found it to be a great blessing. You know, this is even more true as a bishop. Now I'm in a bishop support group, but we meet on Zoom, you know, because bishops don't live that close to each other. But one of the things that happens as a priest is that you're known by a lot more people, right? But the truth is you're not. There's a lot of people who think they know you, and they think you're holy because of the way you celebrate Mass and give a good homily, and they see you only on your best behavior, right? But where are you going to be really known? And where do you find those places where you can let yourself be truly known? The pulpit's not usually the best place for that, right? And it's not always with lay people that you're able to do that. It's often with good priest friends. And being known is a deep human desire. Every human being desires to be known, really known. And even though it's difficult to let people know me in my weakness, we desire it. We desire to be truly known, because that's the only way we can be truly loved. And so finding those places where you have real permission and a safe place with real good friends to be able to share what's really going on in order to be known and loved and get support is extremely important and a great help to priesthood, right? I think really for these fraternal groups to be successful, there's a couple key things. The first is simply the truth of time. Priestly fraternity requires a commitment of time. If I'm going to have real friendship, I have to spend time with friends, right? And priests live busy lives, and you have to make sacrifices to do anything. And so you have to choose to sacrifice time in order to live real fraternity. I've found, though, that sacrifice is really beautiful, right? Second, real friendship requires real vulnerability. And that word vulnerability comes from the Latin word vulnus, which means wound, right? Friendship or vulnerability means allowing others to see my wounds. And it means that I'm willing to share the real me with my real struggles with my brothers. And that allows real friendship. A very beautiful thing happens when you see that your brothers see your weakness and they still choose to love you. That's a really important moment. Personally, I found that one of the great gifts of priestly friendships is the ability to go to confession to my friend. Just to be honest about what my real sins are and to experience in that friendship the Lord's powerful mercy through the power of the sacrament, right? I've also found that vulnerability and honesty in my true friendships helps me to be vulnerable and honest with God. And that there's a relationship between those two things. As I share who I really am with my brothers and I experience their love for me in that, that allows me to accept and receive the love of God. And I would point out that this is especially true for us as celibates. Man cannot live without intimacy. He can live without sexual intimacy. He can live without certain kind of feminine intimacy, right? But he can't live without intimacy. And intimacy is just that, being known and knowing. And so real fraternal charity, real brotherhood, is a great help to living celibacy and prevents me from looking for that intimacy in the wrong places, right? The third thing I think that's important for a good support group is that it should have some measure of accountability. In other words, I agree to let my brothers speak into my life and to offer, when necessary, encouragement or correction or challenge. I agree that I'm going to be accountable to these brothers so that if I stop praying or I stop living the way I'm supposed to be living, I give them permission to speak into that, right? Of course, that's hard, but it's also really essential for growth. The final thing I want to do is just say a word about the reality of seminary, of a presbytery, that some brothers are easier to love than other brothers. It's just true, right? And in any given presbytery, as you enter in to become a member of this presbytery, you'll find that some of the brothers are easier to love than other brothers. And you should be careful because you don't know which kind of brother you are. Right? You might be a brother who's easier to love for some people and harder to love for others. And it's an important call for us to learn to love those whom we find difficult to love. Which, of course, to love means to will their good. So that doesn't mean I always enable bad behavior or things like that. But it means I really want to see their good and will their good. St. John has strong words about this. He says in John 1:3, verse 10 to 17, "By this it may be seen who are the children of God and who are the children of the devil. Whoever does not do right is not of God, nor does he who does not love his brother. For this is the message which you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. and not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's were righteous. Do not wonder, brethren, that the world hates you. We know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brethren. He who does not love abides in death, and anyone who hates his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? So this is a challenging call, and it's true for you in seminary. It'll be true later when you're part of a presbytery, God willing. That is, you're called to love all your brothers, not just those who are easy to love. And this doesn't mean that I have to have the same level of friendship or commitment with each brother in the seminary, but it means I have to learn to see their good and to will their good. And sometimes that takes work. Charity is a supernatural love. One way to say that is that charity begins where human love ends. Charity is willing to look beyond the natural obstacles. One of my favorite writers is a woman named Mother Mary Frances, who was a Poor Clare sister. She's an American saint, I think. She hasn't been canonized yet, but she's written several books, and they're mainly conferences that she gave to her novices. And one of the things she says in one of her books about fraternal charity, she says, it's impossible not to love someone who you truly know. And so she says, if you're having trouble loving a person, you probably don't really know them. Because if you could come to know the circumstances of the way they are and why they are as they are, then your heart would be moved with compassion for them. And so she always encourages us to look again when we find someone difficult to love. The truth is that you don't choose your brothers. You don't choose them in a particular presbyterate. You didn't choose them in the seminary. God chooses them. And so part of divine providence is trusting that God chooses even these difficult brothers so that I can learn more about love and learn more about God. For myself, one of the places I've found that's helpful to meditate on this truth is meditating on John chapter 13, which is the Lord washing the apostles' feet. And of course, it's a very intimate image, and it's also a very humbling image. And for me, it's become a great place to pray, both with and for those brothers whom I find it easy to love, those who have become my closest friends, like I want to wash their feet, I want to serve them. And also for those whom I find it difficult to love, right? Lord, how can I have your attitude of heart? Jesus washed Judas's feet, right? And he did it with love. And so I want to have the same attitude of heart in my own heart. So I'd invite you maybe as you pray with that passage, just to ask the Lord how he might be inviting you to grow in fraternity so that you can be both supported in love and grow in love.